Hi, welcome to Benchmark 3. We're going to be discussing circulation for the next couple of days. And this is a video you'll want to pay very careful attention to, and you'll probably want to come back and look at some of these slides when you get to your activity. We're going to be talking about blood flow through the body, and we've just recently wrapped up our first presentation pit stop. So take a minute to think about how you think that went and maybe what you'll try to do better during the next pit stop. So in the second pit stop, we'll be covering disorders from the circulatory system, respiratory system, excretory, and immune. So these dates obviously aren't correct, but we are still going to do some of the things listed in this timeline. We are going to do a video on what's considered best practice CPR, and that's considered hands-only CPR. Today we're going to talk about the blood flow patterns throughout the body, and I'll give you some instruction on how to do the activity for this lesson. I'll get to blood components in a different video. And then I will do the respiratory system later this week on Wednesday. So there will be a combined quiz over both benchmarks 3 and 4, but keep in mind I'm doing 2 benchmarks in 1 week. It's kind of a shorter lesson. So we'll be talking about CPR. I'm going to see if my paramedic friend Zach wants to go in on the video with me, but we'll be talking about hands-only CPR, and we'll be talking about the different things that happen that requires CPR. So I'm going to skip ahead a few slides and get to the circulation diagram. So today you're going to see in the activity, there are actually 2 coloring sheets if you decide to do the coloring sheets. One of this systemic flow pattern, which kind of helps us understand how blood flows throughout the entire body, and then a more specific diagram of the heart itself. So when we're looking at a diagram, the first thing you might notice is it says right on this side. And if you're looking at it, you might be thinking, wait a second, this is my left. Okay, we always refer to the heart and its right and left sides as if it were situated in the body. So if you put your hand over your heart, your left side is mirrored from what you would be looking at on another person. So please keep that in mind. That's not a mistake. This is actually the right side of the heart because it's the right side of the person. Okay, so this is really important to understand. These colors help us to understand how blood flows through the body in its oxygenated state and then deoxygenated state. And if you do the first page of the coloring sheet, you're going to want to get some red, purple, and blue markers or colored pencils. So blood is going to leave the left side of the heart full of oxygen. Now you might notice this little arrow right here. This is where the oxygenated blood enters the heart, and this is the lung, and there's another arrow coming from the other lung on the other side. So we probably already knew that the lungs provided oxygen to the blood. So let's trace the blood flow. If you follow all of the red pathways, this is oxygenated blood flowing through arteries. So we call arteries blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood, and they're colored in red. Okay. The only reason that this one is called a vein is because blood is leaving the lung, and usually we refer to veins as such. Now, all throughout your body, tissues are full of smaller blood vessels. So arteries break down into arterioles and finally into capillaries. And oxygen is diffused out of the blood. Remember diffusion from our cell tour project, and leaves into the tissues around it. So oxygen is transported throughout the entire body through blood vessels. Okay, now the blood continues to flow, and as the oxygen is depleted, it needs to make its way back to the heart. And so we call veins blood vessels that return blood to the heart. So venules are just smaller veins. Okay, we have veins that come from the upper body. we have veins that come from the lower body. And deoxygenated blood is transferred to the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart will then pump blood back out into the lungs, and then the lungs reoxygenate the blood in the capillaries around the alveoli and then back to the heart. So we have loops that go from the heart to the lung, and we have loops that go through the body. So this is why it's called the two-loop system. And at first glance, it can be kind of tricky, but once you start to follow the pathways and understand where there is oxygen and where there is not a lot of oxygen, it makes a lot of sense. And that's why I like this color-coded pattern. All right, so this is the two-loop system through the body. Now, the second coloring sheet, excuse me, is specifically about the heart. Now, I'm going to tell you, to understand this diagram of the heart, you really need to understand this two-loop system. You need to understand that the lungs are sending oxygenated blood into the left side of the heart, and the right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from the body and needs to send it out to the lungs. So sometimes when people look at this heart diagram, they see all these little tubes and vessels coming out, and they don't really truly understand where those vessels go. And so if you need to, go back to the two-loop picture we just looked at to help you understand. Again, see that right is on this side, even though you're looking at it and it looks like you're left, and left is over here. All right, so this is a diagram that shows how blood flows through a healthy heart. And when we talk about CPR, we can talk about, certain things that go wrong in the system that can cause things like heart attacks. But let's start with some of these color-coded parts of the diagram. So let's say we're going to start with the oxygen poor blood. So we have blue to help us see deoxygenated blood. We have two really big veins that bring deoxygenated blood from the upper part of the body and our lower extremities. And this very, very large blood vessel is called the vena cava. So the superior vena cava is blood coming back from the upper part of our body. And the inferior vena cava down here is collecting deoxygenated blood from the bottom part of our body. So how does this work? Blood is flowing in huge volumes into the right atrium. And we have a 4-chambered heart. You'll hear me mention that several times. 4 chambers of our heart. The right atrium is the upper and smaller of the 2 chambers. The right atrium has a valve that allows blood to flow in through these veins. And this is pretty cool because our valves in our heart and blood vessels, they're all one-way valves so that blood can't back up or flow in an opposite direction. So one-way flow. So the right atrium has a valve that opens, and then there's another valve that connects the right atrium to the right ventricle. Now, back when we discussed muscle, we talked about cardiac muscle being one of the 3 types of muscle. And cardiac muscle is designed to contract in a rhythmic motion. It's actually controlled electrically. So there's a nervous system component that decides when each of these chambers is going to squeeze, and the pressure and the squeezing of these chambers opens these valves. So one-way valve, the right atrium opens into the right ventricle. And these valves have names. This one's called a tricuspid because there's actually 3 flaps. This is a 2-dimensional picture, but tri means 3. The right atrium lets blood flow into the right ventricle, and the ventricles are the larger types of chambers. There are some pretty thick muscular walls here to squeeze a fairly large volume of blood to the lungs. So we have another valve. This is called a pulmonic valve, but it's going, anything pulmo means lungs, pulmonary. We have a valve that opens to our pulmonary arteries, and it branches one way and the other to go to each of our lungs. So we have blood that's deoxygenated going to the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, through another set of valves, and out to the lungs. So the lungs are not pictured here, okay? But there's a lot of blood flow. The blood flows through the lung tissues, collects the oxygen, and then it needs to come back to the heart so that the heart can supply the pressure to push it back through all the other blood vessels in the body. So you have blood pressure because there's constant squeezing and pushing of blood through these veins and arteries that allow it to keep flowing. So we have pulmonary veins here and here that are dumping blood back into the heart. Only now we have red because the blood is oxygenated. So the pulmonary veins dump blood into the left atrium. Okay, so we have two atria. They're both smaller than the ventricles. The left atrium has a valve as well. This is called the mitral valve. And the left ventricle has even thicker muscles. So the left ventricle is actually the thicker and more muscular side of the heart because it has to push blood and provide enough pressure to get this blood all the way out to the different parts of the body. So there's a tremendous amount of squeezing going on in the left ventricle. Okay, the blood has to pass through yet another valve. This is called the aortic valve. And the aorta is the largest artery in the body. So the aorta comes out of the left ventricle and then branches off to the upper part of the body, and then it branches and delivers blood to the lower part of the body. So the color coding here is really important. It's also important to keep going back to this two-loop diagram to understand how blood flows through the entire body. So let's take a look at those coloring sheets before we go any further. All right, so this is page 1 of the coloring sheet. You're using blue, purple, and red. It's very similar to what I just showed you, only it has a couple of extra parts. Kind of talk about blood vessels in the different major organ areas, and it shows the lungs. Okay, so it shows you which color and what color. Don't pay any attention to the points because I've changed them. All right, this is a diagram for the heart, which we just talked about. You do not need to color the lungs unless you want to. It's just another way to visualize blood flow in the heart with the heart and the lungs together. But this right here, this is what's going to take you a while. This is very detailed work, and I've given you colors to choose. If you don't have those colors, you can pick something else. Okay, so you're basically going to be shading in a lot of different parts. It's like color by number, right? Now here's the game that goes with this activity. So if you can't color, you have to do this game. And I had a lot of people turning in screenshots of terrible scores. I'm not going to accept anything other than 100%. So if you don't color and you do this game, you have to do it until you get 100%. And when I say 100%, I mean all green dots, 100%, and you have to screenshot the heart so I can see it. All right, and it shows you the blood flow, and it also shows you different colors for you to see. All right, so left ventricle, there we go, green dot, and it times you. You don't, it doesn't matter about the time. So I'm just going to say quit. I don't want you to take a screenshot of this because I can't see the dots around the heart. Okay, now you will need to turn in, that's not where I want it to be, your either coloring sheet or your game screenshot right here. Circulation and heart coloring sheet. Here's a link to the PDF if you'd like to print it. Here's a link to the game, and then you have a submission box for that. Okay. Next up will be a video on blood components, and we'll talk a little bit about blood. There will not be an assignment for that video, but it's important to talk about, and hopefully you'll tune back in tomorrow for that next lesson. And if it takes you a couple of days to do the heart activity, that's okay too. Good luck.